The mere event of the death and resurrection of Jesus is not particularly significant. Apart from the fact that this was an event in the life of God, by the will of God, and a self-revelation of the character of God. That is a quote from the biblical scholar Adam Johnson, and welcome to Solomon's Bookcase, Biblical Studies for the Critical Thinker, and a theological repair kit for the perceptive but disillusioned among us. My name is Steve. Nice to meet you. I hold a master's degree from Denver Seminary in Old Testament Studies, and have also completed PhD coursework at McMaster Divinity College in Ontario, Canada. I have also been performing lay ministry for over 20 years, and I am so grateful and excited that you have joined us for this podcast. Our first series is going to be on the study of the Atonement, which you're joining us for right now. And our first several episodes are going to be on the topic of the Atonement. So you might ask, what is that, and why spend multiple episodes fleshing it out? Well, you've probably heard the expression, or you've heard someone say that Jesus died for you. Jesus died for your sins, however they phrased it. And usually when someone says something like that, Jesus died for you, it's in the context of them attempting to describe the significance, the purpose of Jesus' death and resurrection, right? Why was it so important that Jesus die? And maybe to drill in a bit further, why was it important for him to die in the particular way that he did? Of course, we know that Jesus was crucified and went through some pretty terrible torture and psychological, physical, and otherwise. Well, was that important? Was it important that Jesus' death happened in that particular way? When he did die, why should we care? Well, the argument goes that, of course, this death produced a very real and important spiritual effect for each and every one of us. So if we accept for the sake of argument that Jesus was indeed divine, Jesus calls himself the Son of God. If Jesus is telling the truth, he's divine, not just a man that lived, but also fully God, part of the essence of God, God made into man. Why does him being tortured and put to death have any bearing on what we call sin? Sin being this universal human quality of coming up short in terms of moral perfection, right? Sin as a failure to love, as Father Jim Martin has concisely put it. Why does killing God do anything about my sin? Or yours? I mean, does this idea even make sense? Think about this. Isn't killing God, which is essentially what we do when we nail Jesus to a cross, right, 2,000 years ago, but isn't killing God inherently the most sinful thing that we as humans could possibly accomplish? So why would the ultimate sinful act bring about a forgiveness of sins? What's the mechanism there? Why should it matter if Jesus dies or not? Well, these are the kinds of questions that I want to address over the next several episodes. Of course, I believe that it does matter, and it matters very strongly. I don't believe it's enough for me to just say that, or for some pastor or priest to just proclaim that. I want us to think through, as so many biblical scholars and theologians have thought throughout the many centuries of church tradition. Why does Jesus' death really matter? What is the mechanism at play that leads to this salvation event, this forgiveness of sins? I'll warn you now, these are the kinds of questions that make some people nervous to ask, or to be asked if you're in a position of religious authority as a Christian. But just know that these are valid questions about our topic, the Atonement. And they're questions, as I said, that scholars, theologians, pilgrims in the faith of Christ have been asking for 2,000 years of church history. Trust me, we are not the first ones to ask these questions. I think it's only right that we ask them too. It's not heretical to wonder why killing Jesus has anything to do with us coming into right relationship with God. And again, of course, I believe that it does have everything to do with us coming into right relationship with God. It's a foundational question of the Christian faith. It's one that sooner or later we have to reflect on if we are to more fully appreciate what Jesus, the Messiah's crucifixion, death, and resurrection actually mean, and why we look to Jesus for that salvation experience that the crucifixion and resurrection make possible. Okay, so in this series of episodes on the atonement, what I want to do is to explore that question. Jesus' crucifixion, first century Jerusalem, and his resurrection from the dead just a few days later. I want to understand, why do those events free us from the effects of sin and bring us back into proper relationship with God? Most of you listening to today's episode probably have seen a cross in the shape of a giant T. Now, I know most of you know exactly what I'm talking about, but a few may not, so bear with me for a moment. Often these crosses can be seen hanging from the wall of the sanctuary, the main room of worship in a church. The Protestant or evangelical kind of cross is usually just the T itself, while the Catholic version will actually have a figure of Jesus fixed onto the cross. This is often called a crucifix. Anglican and some other Protestant churches will sometimes have a crucifix as well. I will never forget being at my largely Methodist university. After growing up and being confirmed Catholic, the unsettling amount of arguments that I found myself being subjected to as to which was more proper, a cross or a crucifix. It is an insanely stupid argument to get into. As far as I'm concerned, both portray valid and important, though different, aspects of the crucifixion event. I mention this only because you may have been introduced to a Christian faith in a tradition that highly valued either the cross or the crucifix. And you might have strong ties or opinions on which is better. However it looks, however it's displayed, the cross is meant as a reminder of an event in the life of Jesus, which we call the crucifixion. However we choose to memorialize that in our houses of worship. A man who claimed a divine identity with the Jewish God, Yahweh. This man was tortured by flogging and then suspended above the ground on a wooden structure, fastened to it with nails, and eventually succumbed to his execution. And we fixate on this execution and the resurrection that the scriptures tell us happened a few days later as the centerpiece event of the Christian faith. The argument which the faith makes is that this execution possessed a supernatural property. When I read the accounts of the death of Jesus, I'm often taken with the reactions of all the people witnessing his execution. There's his students called disciples. His mother Mary is there. Also the Roman soldiers are there taunting him. There's these two criminals also hanging, playing out their own execution stories right next to him, one on either side. There's the Jewish religious leaders called the Pharisees and the scribes. They're there. The Sadducees are probably there. And presumably lots and lots of other civilians who have to pass by this man, prophet, divine being, who is physically suffering and in anguish. The end of Jesus' mortal life transpires in a very public space. Crucifixions were public, and that's by design. And we're going to talk about that more in episode 2 at some length, why that was. Now, when we read a story, or what's called a narrative in the scriptures, there are strategies that contemplative Christians have used to dig more deeply into that passage. The intent, obviously, is to understand it better. Now, one of the simplest strategies, which is a very effective strategy, I find, not everyone, this isn't everyone's bag. I definitely enjoy it, and I get a lot out of it. This is a Jesuit practice. And essentially what we do here is we try to place ourselves into the scene, into that narrative, into that story. We imagine ourselves in the middle of the text. We interact with it. We interact with the characters, the personalities. We interact with the landscape, with the setting. We observe it. And maybe as a consequence, we understand something new about the text. So I try and put myself into this scene, into the page, 20 centuries past. Here's one of the questions that very quickly surfaces for me when I do this. Would I have been able, seeing this crucifixion transpire, would I have been able to piece together for myself the significance of what was happening? Now, what if I had been following Jesus around, what today we call Israel and Jordan? What if I had been following him around there for 1, 2, 3 years? Would I be able then to sort of put 2 and 2 together and begin to write and talk about the theological significance of this death, the way Paul is going to be able to do in the decades to come in his letters? If you're standing there, as the old spirituals go, at the foot of the old rugged cross, would a reasonably observant individual such as yourself be able to understand the event as one of cosmic and universal significance? Could you articulate that in that moment?
Someday for a crown in the old rugged cross, stained with blood so divine, a wondrous spirit I see.
There's a scene that appears in the Gospel of Luke in the very last chapter. We meet these 2 men walking between Jerusalem and a little village called Emmaus, which is about 7 miles away, give or take. Now, these 2 men were disciples of Jesus, students who had presumably been traveling with him, learning from him, serving the poor with him, casting out demons with him, which, believe me, we're going to talk about that at some point in a future episode, this whole casting out of demons thing. That'll be fun to tackle that. But they're doing all of these things with Jesus for a period of time prior to his death. So obviously they're acquainted with Jesus, they know him, they know something about his ministry and who he is. Now, just a couple of hours before, they apparently were at Jesus' tomb, which of course is now, empty. If you're familiar with the story. The tomb is empty. Jesus has been crucified, buried in this tomb, and now just a few days later come to find out this tomb is empty. Well, there's burial wrappings folded neatly in the corner. Now, the text doesn't say they were folded or if they were folded neatly. All it says is that the linen wraps that were covering Jesus' body were there without a body. Wouldn't it be fascinating, this is a total side note, wouldn't it be fascinating, though, if the linens that had been covering Jesus' body had been folded and placed neatly in the corner of this tomb? Now, don't get me wrong, theologically this wouldn't mean a thing. But what a window into Jesus' personality that would have been. It's those kinds of details that we in the biblical studies world only wish we had. Okay, back to our story though. If you and your friend had just seen all of this, and now what? You're walking together, you've got a 7-mile walk, some time to kill. I mean, what would you be talking about? The guy who disappeared from his tomb, probably. Who happens to be your friend and your mentor. Yeah, let's talk about that. But we might actually get a sense of Jesus' personality from what happens next. In fact, I think we do. Now, the text of Luke chapter 24 says that Jesus, in a post-resurrection manifestation, just sort of casually walks up to these 2 men and starts walking with them and talking with them. Now, for whatever reason, the text says that their eyes were, quote, prevented from recognizing him. Now remember, these are two guys who definitely have every reason in the world to recognize him. He asks them, hey, what have you been talking about? As if he doesn't know. And one of the men replies, are you the only person visiting Jerusalem that doesn't know the things that have been happening? And you know that Jesus is having fun with these guys because he fires back, oh, what things? Now, I'm a sarcastic person, and I appreciate some wit in my faith figures. So I love this idea that maybe a post-resurrection Jesus is just having a little bit of fun with these students of his before he drops this bombshell, hey, it's me. So after some more back and forth, here's what Jesus says to these men. Essentially, you guys are so dense. Quote, so slow to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory? End quote. And the text then says that starting with Moses and going all through the messages of the prophets, so essentially from the beginning to the end of the scriptures, Jesus explains the text. Now, if we had a recording of that conversation, by the way, the first 8 episodes of this podcast, 9 episodes, whatever it ends up being, would probably be completely unnecessary, or at least have the potential to go in a much different direction. Why do you think that Luke includes this story? These two men who traveled with Jesus for some or most of his earthly ministry seem to have been largely blindsided by not only the crucifixion, but also the resurrection. These two men return to Jerusalem where these disciples are hiding out, and they tell their story. Jesus appears to them again, this time the whole group of disciples together. They, of course, freak out, as is understandable. Jesus shows them his wounds, and then he says, hey, is there anything to eat? That is a literal translation, by the way. He asks them if there's something to eat. He's toying with them. I love it. And then the text says that he opens their minds to understand the Old Testament scriptures, how they've been pointing to the suffering of the righteous Messiah and how redemption was to come. This time of teaching, this post-resurrection Jesus and his former students, this time of teaching might have actually lasted for 40 days, according to Acts chapter 1. And here's how Jesus concludes that time. Quote, so it is written that the Messiah would suffer and rise again from the dead on the 3rd day, and that repentance for forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. End quote. So the indications are that these disciples had the raw data they needed to start synthesizing an understanding of the atonement. But it's like the puzzle pieces were there in a jumbled mass on the living room floor. And Jesus had to come along with the box top that has the photo of the finished puzzle. There's also a pretty obvious IKEA joke in there somewhere. Bottom line, much assembly required. Of all the things we could highlight from this scene, what I'd like for us to notice is that all these people, men and women, that Jesus is appearing to after his resurrection, had been with him for substantial periods of time during his ministry. They were with him as he taught the crowds. They observed his character and his methods day in, day out. They were at least somewhat familiar with the Old Testament text. Otherwise, Jesus couldn't have referred to them and used them for teaching. But here's what I'm wondering. Did they understand the purpose behind Jesus' sufferings? Did they understand the crucifixion as it was happening? Did they grasp the true agony of God in human form being hoisted up to his execution? Did they understand the relational freedom inherent in his resurrection? No. No. The answer has to be no, based on the evidence that we have. See, I don't think that Jesus is truly upset with his disciples for not getting it. It's most of the reason he comes back to help them along. He's with them them for 40 days after his resurrection, teaching them, helping them connect the dots, putting the puzzle together with them. He's the box top. He's trying to put what they just experienced and seen into the context of what God is trying to accomplish. This is a long-form method of introducing this idea that the purpose and the function of Jesus Christ's suffering and death on a cross was not immediately obvious. And so beginning with these disciples of Jesus in Luke and Acts, then Peter and Paul, the early church, and on from there, we now have behind us a 2,000-year tradition of people who have been contemplating this event. There seems to be a sizable camp of religious teachers in our own day that teach the Bible just spells it all out for us. If we just, quote, know our Bibles well enough, the meaning of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection should be obvious. Now, if that was true, this podcast probably would not need to enter the world. If there's a right answer to every theological question and it's just dependent upon reading our Bible often enough or going to the right church or Sunday school class, as some maintain is true, then any further exploration of the atonement or any other topic would just be a matter of memorizing the answers. And some of you listening, that might have been the very way that faith was presented to you. If you just memorize the right answers, everything else will take care of itself. And what I'm maintaining, and going to maintain throughout this series on the atonement offered by Christ, is that it wasn't obvious to Jesus' own disciples and his own family. And they had personal access to Jesus and his teachings on a daily basis. They were active participants in that ministry. So we also shouldn't expect that it's immediately obvious to us either, or that it should be. And so it's natural and right, I believe what God actually intended, for us to interrogate the atoning work of Christ, using the Old and New Testaments as our guideposts, but also acknowledging the rich traditions and interpretations that we have been gifted, because we have been gifted them as an irreplaceable tool. And that serious scholars and theologians of faith continue to press into the question of the significance of the atonement even today. The best of these voices, and many of the voices I hope to bring you in the coming episodes, are conducting their observations and conversations with the guidance of the Holy Spirit. It doesn't mean that they're right or wrong, but rather that they're committing their research to the community of believers for our benefit in our own lives of faith, and we have the ability to interact with them and think critically alongside them. As we mentioned, the first several episodes of this podcast are going to deal with the history of thought on the atoning work of Christ. What models have people arrived at? The modern day discussions and controversies. Perhaps you were introduced to the Romans Road or the four spiritual laws in youth group or college. So we're going to explore, are these models simplistic but essentially accurate? Or are they exhibiting some foundational errors in logic? Are they sufficient to live out a mature faith? Now, I grew up Catholic, and we didn't grow up with the Romans Road. We instead experienced atonement through the rituals of the church, the sacraments like confession and communion, with a heavy emphasis on the incarnation of Christ. We're going to talk about all that later in a coming episode. But the institution of the church really had to be the one to provide the vehicle of atonement to us. It's a very different understanding in some ways from a Protestant or evangelical approach. So what about that? What about the Catholic approach? Does it rely too heavily on a fallible religious institution to mediate those graces. So our next episode will continue our examination into the effects of the crucifixion, before moving on into discussions on various models of salvation that you've probably been exposed to, whether or not you realized it. Things like the Romans Road or the Four Spiritual Laws, Christus Victor, the warrior god, the satisfaction model, and so on. And eventually we'll attempt to synthesize these understandings of Jesus in his life, death, and resurrection. Once we've, tackled the meaning of Jesus, right, then I figure let's just keep going into some other topics. Maybe the formation of the scriptures will be our next series after the Atonement. Haven't quite solidified for sure that that's the direction we're going to take yet or not, but it'll be fun.